morning, all, and welcome to the October 20th meeting of the Citizen Oversight Board. We are joined today by the 911 leader, Andrew Dameron. Is that how you say your last name?
Dameron.
Dameron. Okay, thanks. I'm excited to hear a lot about the 911 center. It's obviously integral to the system of public safety in the city, and so your role is very important there. We'll first start off by calling the meeting to order and welcoming Larry back from his sabbatical. Yay! We're glad to have you. Hope that your sabbatical was restful and rejuvenating.
Happy to be back. Thank you. Yes, it was.
Any hot tips for a successful sabbatical?
Yeah, it was great. I spent time in Belize, and it was good because people couldn't get a hold of me if they wanted to.
Amazing.
Once I got back into the country, even though I was on sabbatical. So when you really want to take a break, disconnect, make it hard for people to get a hold of you.
Okay, awesome tip. Okay, also, first announcement is that Council has introduced a resolution to appoint Alfredo Reyes, Executive Director of the Latino Cultural Arts Center, to the board's vacant seat. The resolution is on the Finance and Governance Committee consent agenda for next week, and then it will go to the full council. So it's safe to assume that Alfredo will be our new board member, and I think that's really exciting. And we'll welcome him when he joins. Okay, moving on to our next order of business. I would like to approve the minutes from our September 15th. It's been a while since we've met. September 15th meeting. If I could have a motion from someone who has read them.
I think it's October 6th meeting.
Oh, okay. I was like, I thought we had a meeting between then. Sorry, my notes are not. October 6th. Thank you. I'll update my notes. May I have a motion?
So moved.
Okay.
Second.
All in favor, aye?
Aye.
Any opposed? Great. The motion passes. All right. With that, any other board business that we need to cover? Okay. Andrew, thank you for joining us. I know we sent you 150,000 questions in advance of you coming today. So if you want to work through those questions, if you wouldn't mind reading the question in advance of your answer, and then it's helpful to the board if you could just pause after you've said what you're going to say, and then we can ask questions from there. And then I may do a time check on us and sort of cut you off mid question in order to get to general board questions that maybe aren't covered in our list, just for the sake of time. But
and for the sake of time, about how long do I have to work through these? Because I can speed up or slow down.
This meeting is about an hour, so should be enough.
I'll try to go quick. Leave time for questions. All right.
And our preference is to have more dialogue rather than less. So
Sure.
Don't feel like you're giving a high school presentation, poster presentation. So we'll happily engage you in questions on this. And I'll turn it over to you.
Okay. Well, thank you all for inviting me to come speak to you today. Andrew Dameron, Director of Denver 911. I'll start working my way through the questions and we'll start there. So the first question was, could you please provide an overview or walkthrough of the various processes and workflows that happen when someone calls 911? The first sub question is, what is the difference between a call taker and a dispatcher? So in the 911 system, when you dial 911 to kind of start at the very beginning, your call is routed into the 911 phone system. Colorado has our own emergency services IP network, which we built as a state. That call is routed there and then routed to a 911 call center based on one of two things. And one of the later questions touches on this. The old method was the address of the nearest cell tower to your location. If you are in East Colfax, for example, and a cell tower that's closest to you is right across Yosemite and Aurora, you're actually going to get, you would have gotten routed to Aurora. Then they would have had to transfer the call to us. More recently, the cell carriers have started implementing location-based routing, which actually pulls some of the GPS data off of your mobile device, the same GPS data that Uber or DoorDash uses, and uses that to route the call differently. I'll go ahead and jump to that question as far as, is location-based routing in place for Denver with the major carriers? And yes, it is. We have AT&T just did it nationwide. T-Mobile and Verizon both had to be requested, and those requests have been submitted and the work completed. The only caveat I would add to that is the work also has to be requested and completed in neighboring jurisdictions. So I have reached out to my peers around the metro area. All of them are in various stages of that process. So just because location-based routing has been turned on in Denver doesn't mean it's going to work 100% of the time, because it also has to be turned on in Jefferson County and Aurora and Adams County and everywhere else. So then going back to the first question, once that call is routed to us, it is answered by one of our 911 call takers or emergency communication technicians. They will receive location data for that caller, and then they will start asking questions. They'll verify location and then ask, tell me what's happening. What is the nature of your emergency? As soon as they have enough information to create a snapshot, basically a headline of what it is that this call is about, they select one of many nature codes. And then those nature codes in our computer-aided dispatch software programmatically then duplicate that event on the appropriate dispatcher's screen. So the dispatchers are a separate position. We have a police dispatch team, a fire dispatch team, and an EMS dispatch team. If the call is a domestic violence in progress, that call will be duplicated on the police dispatcher screen. If it is an injury accident on the highway, it's going to be duplicated on the police dispatcher, the EMS dispatcher, and the fire dispatcher screen. So in that case, for that traffic accident, you've actually now got 4 people who are kind of collaborating within the same incident within CAD. They can see each other's notes, they can ask each other questions. And what that does is it allows our dispatchers to send help, get help rolling while the call taker remains on the line with the caller and continues to ask questions and get more information. You also asked on the Department of Safety's dispatch dashboard, a significant portion of the calls are classified as 911 ops rather than police, fire, EMS. Can you describe what kinds of calls might fall into that category? So this one, it's a bit of a technical answer. Our computer-aided dispatch software creates agencies for every entity operating within that CAD. So you have police, you have fire, you have EMS, and you have 911 ops, which basically represents our 911 call takers. So anytime we receive a 911 call and that call taker creates a CAD incident, that shows up as 911 ops. That's what that is representing. There are calls that could be just 911 ops. For example, somebody calls and they have to be transferred somewhere else, to the jail, to a district station. We'll create that CAD incident, but then we transfer the call and close it out. And there's just a 911 ops incident for that. Others, there will be, for example, that traffic accident, there will be a 911 ops, there will be a police, there will be a fire, there will be an EMS. So there is some duplicative data there, but 911 ops basically just represents any 911 call where the 911 call taker created a CAD incident. Pause there if y'all have any questions. Okay. You also asked, are you responsible for handling calls on the non-emergency line? If so, how are those calls handled? And how do we determine what constitutes an emergency? So I'll answer the last question first. An emergency that should come to 911 really falls into 3 categories: to save a life, to report a crime or stop a crime in progress, or to report a fire. Those are the items that really should come through 911. Everything else that isn't an emergency comes through the non-emergency line. Ideally, that's not how it happens all the time. But yes, our team are responsible for answering the non-emergency line. Most 911 centers around the country manage both queues for their jurisdictions. You've got 911, and then you usually have a 10-digit non-emergency queue. The way those calls come in is 911 calls are prioritized. So if we have 3 or 4 non-emergency calls waiting to be answered and a 911 call comes in, it gets moved to the front of the line. As soon as there are no 911 calls waiting, then the call takers start working through those non-emergency calls. Our non-emergency call volume is about 60% of our overall call volume year over year. For that reason, that represented a place where we could augment the 911 team and free them up so that they are more likely to be ready and available when a 911 call comes in. If you think about the sheer number of non-emergency calls that we take, as soon as we work through all the 911 calls, then everybody's on a non-emergency call. That next 911 call comes in and it's going to sit there and wait until one of those non-emergency calls is completed. So what we wanted to do was offload as much of that as possible. So back in the spring of 2021 was when I had first pitched that idea around a 2-number system for the city and county of Denver, 911 for emergencies, 311 for everything else. For obvious reasons, that's a pretty significant change and lift, even just from a technological standpoint. So what the city did is they worked with us to create a new group within 911. These are our non-emergency communication technicians. These are folks that we are able to hire and train. Their training is 6 weeks, whereas a 911 call taker takes 6 months to fully train. So we could get these folks up and running much faster. We were also able to leverage less critical technology to allow them to work from home. We could leverage the changes in labor force expectations. And so we started with 10, we now have 15 and a supervisor. All but the supervisor are working remotely from home, 40 hours a week, plus some overtime, answering non-emergency calls. I'll pause there real quick.
Yeah, I do have a question.
Yes.
I serve on my RNO, and we had a meeting this week, and a representative of the mayor's office. There's a micro community being built in my district, and the representative of the mayor's office suggested that a large encampment can receive as many as 6,000 calls a month from the public about, concerns there. That's like 200 a day. And so I just wondered, how, I don't know that number is accurate, but that's what they said. But how much of the non-emergency line is related to, like if you broke out your categories, a single encampment generating 200 calls a day seems like that would overwhelm the non-emergency line pretty quickly.
Yes. And I am willing to bet that number is a cumulative number across all reporting mechanisms. So that includes 311, that includes online reporting through what used to be Pocket Gov, what is now Denver Gov. For the last couple years, 311 has been combining. So we send them a report of all the encampment calls that we get, which is not that many, I can assure you. And then it's all kind of combined as just to kind of create that larger picture. So I'm not sure who that was, but my best guess would be that's the data that they're pulling from. I would have to double check to say for sure.
Okay. Yeah. It was more just like, how could any city manage that number of phone calls?
Sure.
So, okay. And then, having 2 numbers requires the user to know that 2 numbers exist and then understand which number to use when. And, if I hold myself in high regard, I might say everything I am worried about is an emergency and use that number. And so how effective is it to sort of, are people calling the right number for the right things? Or what are you seeing there?
So I will quote one of our fire department partners. He said, you know what, you can just blame all the country's fire departments, because especially in the 70s and 80s, we went around to schools and we told everybody, call 911. If you've got an emergency, call 911. We did a really good job of socializing that phone number as the one to use. The downside is the number of calls that we get through 911 that are not emergencies is pretty high. So our solution to that is regular kind of public education campaigns. I'm working with our PIO's office on a new one, actually copying what they did up in Canada, to really highlight that if you're calling 911 for a non-emergency, you could potentially be blocking somebody who has a life or death emergency from getting through. And that's the message that we have to kind of continually push out. With that said, we have kind of changed our call processing procedure a little bit to allow us to more quickly identify, is this call actually an emergency? And if there are 911 calls holding, we've instructed our call takers to then transfer that call to the non-emergency line so that they can get through those emergency calls. But public education is one of the biggest pieces.
Okay, thanks. And then one more follow-up question, and if other board members have questions. Different communities in the city have different experiences with public safety in general. And I would presume that translates into different call rates for different geographies. So, what kind of analysis do you do about that, and understanding, you can't manifest concerns for people in different communities, but, people don't trust the system, they're not going to call. And so I just wonder, what data do you have about that? What do you do about it? And, is there some activity in your organization about that?
Mm-hmm. So one of the concerns that I have heard is that folks who live in certain parts of the city believe that their calls are not prioritized. Or not answered as quickly. And so one of the things, and we've actually in some of our work with some of these community groups invited them out for a tour so they can kind of see how the system works. 911 calls are automatically dropped to the next available call taker. So there's not actually any decision making going on around which calls to answer. And they can't see where the call is coming from until after they answer it anyway. So there's it is technologically impossible for us to pick and choose which calls we answer and put up for a response. Beyond that, there are several pretty comprehensive mechanisms within Department of Public Safety around particularly the emergency medical response system, and identifying trends through the data. And creating solutions in order to make sure that we are serving all corners of the city equally. One of the projects that we've been partnering with Denver Health on is we identified that we have a great deal of 911 calls that come through that require a non-emergent ambulance response. These are folks who call 911 because they need a ride to the hospital because they have the flu, or it's not a life-threatening emergency, right? It is not uncommon to get a 911 call from somebody who says, yeah, my leg kind of hurts, and that's really it. And so our only response option was to send them an ambulance, and which is expensive, not just for the city, but for the person calling as well, and then take them to the emergency room. So we began working with Denver Health to expand our nurse line. So we now have the ability for some of these lower acuity medical calls to connect that person with a registered nurse. The Denver Health nurse line can connect that person with a primary care provider if they don't have one. They can send them, instead of an ambulance to take them to the ED, they can send them an Uber to take them to urgent care, which is far less expensive for the patient. And a lot of the data showed that these calls were coming from the neighborhoods within our city with the greatest need for additional resources. So this was a way that we could improve response and provide better response rather than just sending an ambulance and a trip to the ED every single time. So that's I think a pretty good example of some of that proactive work that we've been doing.
Yeah, interesting. So that the transaction for an ambulance is pretty different, right? The city probably has a master services agreement and gets a general bill, but like, how does that work from an Uber standpoint? Who pays for that Uber?
Oh, we do.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. No, the city pays for it.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So, Director, I have a sort of a related question to that. As somebody who has been responsible for caring for a senior person of my family who has been in assisted living, for a while, the go-to default response when there is ever any sort of issue with somebody in these facilities is to call 911 and an ambulance comes.
Yep.
Have you worked, and I would think that, and certainly it's warranted at times, but at many times it's not warranted. And to your point, it costs money, for the person, for the system, all of that. I mean, I know that there are groups, but they're not particularly effective, that can come to these homes and address any sort of issues to determine whether it's necessary for this person to be taken to the hospital. But I wonder is there any sort of are there any proactive measures going on there? Are there any efforts to to have a dialogue with assisted living facilities, independent living facilities, memory care facilities to address these types of issues?
That is an excellent question. I do know that some of those conversations have happened. Certainly when we get calls from medical facilities, we'll actually connect them directly to the Denver Health team, so they can kind of talk system to system. However, one of the things that we've identified is that the one thing that we won't do, even with this additional nurse line, if someone is adamant that they need an ambulance and they want an ambulance, we're not going to tell them no. And so that's what we're going to send. And so what we've identified is there is absolutely a need for some of that education and kind of proactive collaboration about how do we help folks in the appropriate way, rather than just throwing an ambulance at the problem every single time. So those conversations have begun. But I don't have anything to report yet about any positive outcomes there yet.
Thank you. It's definitely something that's needed, because there are many, many unnecessary calls that get placed at 911 in those circumstances. And there's obviously the senior living community is worried about liability, so their default is always, let's just call and get an ambulance here. Yep.
Okay. Let's see.
It looks like Terrence also has a question.
Sorry, Terrence.
Thanks for joining us this morning. I have a question around this concept of priming the pump, or dispatch priming on some more critical calls. I know around the country there have been some concerns that in potentially violent situations, that the dispatcher can prime the situation more by the information or lack of information that they provide to the officer. So what type of training do you provide to your dispatchers to try to mitigate against that possibly happening?
Absolutely. So in the case of our medical calls, all of our call takers are emergency medical dispatch certified. They're certified through the International Academies of Emergency Dispatch. Our medical protocols that we work through are all signed off and approved by the city's medical director. And we have regular meetings to make sure that those protocols are being utilized correctly and that changes don't need to be made. Those are very stringent and pretty prescriptive. When it comes to law enforcement calls, our training program is such that we are training our call takers to receive the information, document it without inserting narrative or opinion or anything along those lines. They take the information, they document it, and then our dispatchers likewise are to air the information as they receive it, without, again, inserting any sort of subjective narrative, if you will. Does that answer your question? Okay. The last question in here was, are you responsible for handling calls to the 988 mental health hotline? If so, how are those calls handled? We are not answering 988 calls. Colorado is fortunate that we have a single 988 provider for the entire state. That is Rocky Mountain Crisis Partners. They were the managers of the 10-digit crisis hotline before 988 was a thing. and continue to be the sole provider. We do work in partnership with 988. In fact, myself and a couple other folks here are a part of the state's 988 911 steering committee in helping to identify best practice policy procedure for how 988 and 911 can collaborate most effectively. But those calls, if we do get a call that is applicable for 988 and not applicable for STAR, which is a pretty narrow band of calls, we do have a method by which we can transfer those calls to them. Likewise, if they get a call that needs emergency response, either from law enforcement or an ambulance, they have essentially a backdoor emergency number, and they can transfer that call to us immediately. All right, moving into, unless there's any questions about 988. Okay. How are STAR calls dispatched? Per your comments at a conference this summer and a recent NYU policing project report based on interviews from December 2021, 911 dispatchers sometimes send police to calls alongside STAR. Do you know how often this is happening? I'm glad that you included in there that those interviews were from almost 2 years ago. It's one of the challenges of doing an academic study when a program is A, still in its infancy, and B, while some of the improvements are still ongoing. So a lot of the challenges that they outlined were 100% correct, and we had solutions for them before the report was even released. So the way I think the conference you're referring to was talking to some of our peers around the country who are really looking to Denver as the model for similar kind of community-based response programs. And one of the things that I have shared with my 911 peers is that this is a new thing for our industry, right? 911 celebrated its 55th anniversary, and for 55 years, we've been dispatching cops and ambulances to these calls. And so when you introduce a new methodology, a new way of thinking about how we deliver public safety support, that comes with it a requirement that you also shift the culture and the mindset and make sure that your dispatchers understand the why. And so we did find that early on, we had dispatchers concerned about liability who were attaching police officers to STAR calls, because if something bad happened, they didn't want it coming back on them. We've addressed that by making our policy and procedure clear, making sure that the city attorney's office has signed off on those policies, including policies that say, if this is a STAR eligible call and they request STAR only, and there is no public safety concern, we can dispatch STAR or no one, right? And given the bandwidth, it could mean that nobody responds, and we need to manage that expectation on the front end to the caller. But it is perfectly acceptable not to send anyone if the only alternative is to send police or an ambulance. That caused a lot of heartburn on the team, because we are 911. You call us for help, we're going to send you help. And if the first best isn't available, we're going to send you the second best and on down the line. So we had to kind of shift things. So we started developing training. Matter of fact, the last 2 weeks, our staffing is finally at a point where we can pull people off the phones and the radios for about an hour to do in-service training, comprehensive group training. And we've been doing it specifically around STAR and co-response. We are fortunate that we have both of those response options available, STAR and then co-response if we need that mental health, behavioral health expertise on scene, but there is a scene safety element that still requires a law enforcement presence. And making sure our dispatchers understood those two different response options, and that we have it, they understand why we send STAR, why we send co-response, rather than just sending STAR with police attached to it. So what we have seen is a steady decrease in the number of times where police are responding with STAR as a result of our dispatchers' actions. Now, there are plenty of other scenarios where police could respond with STAR, whether it's police officers kind of proactively responding because they hear that over the radio, STAR responding and then requesting police presence, or even police being dispatched to a call because based on the information we received, it was a law enforcement call, arriving on scene and saying, you know what, this isn't for us, can you send STAR instead? So those situations still exist, but we are tackling at least our side of it, right? Making sure that we are dispatching the right response to the right call at the right time.
So, Director, are you saying basically it's been an evolving process of education of your folks?
Education, policy, procedure, yes, all of the above. What we are trying to do is set STAR up as the fourth response option, right? And there are I'm a part of a couple of statewide efforts where that is our stated goal. We want to create this as its own niche of public safety response that is a fourth option, not just an alternative to the big three, police, fire, and EMS, if those aren't available, right? But if it's just an alternative, those still remain the default. So if STAR's not available, well, police is the default as it always been, so we're just going to dispatch police. That's what we're trying to move away from. And so we're doing things. For example, we have furniture that's on its way. We're building out a dedicated dispatch console within Denver 911 just for STAR, so that we can have a single dispatcher managing the STAR call volume citywide. It will give us the ability to kind of triage those calls by acuity a little more effectively, and give us a little better kind of operational oversight about how STAR is being deployed around the city.
Are you seeing that being supported in the data, the recent data?
So I have a report, and it's very kind of macro level, basically. STAR responses that also where a STAR unit and a police unit were assigned to the same call. And we are seeing a decline in those numbers. Like I said, our training and quality assurance team are currently digging into the story of all of that, because that requires going into individual incidents, reading through the notes. So it's a little bit laborious, but we're working through that to identify, okay, what are the patterns? Why are we seeing STAR and police response on the same calls? Where can we start making some changes to make sure that we're dispatching correctly? Our policy and procedure is meeting the needs of the city.
What I agree that that'd be an individual analysis where there's a dispatch of both. But are you prioritizing, for example, if you get complaints, for example, in instances where there is a dispatch of STAR and police, and somebody then gets back to you, I don't know who, and says, was not appropriate for police to be dispatched jointly. Are those, I'll call them complaints, are they prioritized in terms of you're looking at that and trying to correct the issue?
Yes. So every complaint that we get, whether it's about STAR or anything else, is reviewed kind of top to bottom. The Community Advisory Council is kind of our primary conduit to some of these operational issues from a community perspective. And so we continue to ask them, if you guys get information, even if it's anecdotal, send us as much detail as you can so that we can look into it. Date, time, if you can, what phone number was used to call for help, because we can dig into our phone system and get details there. And then our quality assurance team and our STAR program manager can dig into it, figure out, what if policy and procedure was followed, or if not, address that with individuals, or follow up with that person and say, hey, actually, here's what happened. It was dispatched correctly, but this happened while on scene, and that led to a police response, or whatever the anecdotal scenario might be.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. At a recent STAR Community Advisory Committee meeting, it was reported that a call had been dispatched for a STAR response that was unilaterally claimed in the system or taken over by a police officer. Can you describe the level of access that DPD has to calls that are not dispatched to them, and specifically STAR calls? So because currently STAR calls are dispatched by our police dispatchers, and STAR calls are a subset of police calls based on how the pilot program was built, DPD can see all calls on their MDT, whether it's DPD or STAR. And this has been a benefit. You know, as I mentioned before, there are times where police can request STAR because they don't feel that they're the appropriate response for a call that they were dispatched to. Likewise, STAR can get on and request DPD. There have been situations where they just need help, you know, directing traffic. If we have someone who's in crisis, who's on a busy street corner, and they just need police to come make sure the scene is safe for that individual and the clinicians, they have that ability. In this particular case, the one that was brought up on the community advisory meeting, a call was kind of, we call it jumped or grabbed by DPD. And as far as our approach goes, you know, we work in partnership with DPD, Denver Fire, and Denver Health Paramedics. They are out in the field. They have existing relationships and knowledge about kind of what's going on in the city. And if they come over the air and say, you know what, we need to take that one instead, we take them at their word, assume positive intent, and defer to their expertise. I will say this is not the norm. It doesn't happen very often, but there are isolated cases where that can happen. As far as the mobile data terminals go, STAR will have their own very, very soon. We've been working on getting the tablets provisioned and all of the STAR personnel through state mandated security training. Once that's done, they will have the same access to kind of view calls that are holding around the city. Going back to our objective in creating a dedicated STAR dispatch console, what that will do is create the opportunity for the STAR vans to see STAR calls around the city and have a better understanding of what's going on kind of citywide, rather than where they are today. They'll see the STAR calls and the police calls just for the district in which they are. So again, continuing to move not just our operations, but the technology to support STAR as its own response entity, not just an alternative to what we've traditionally done. And then I answered about the STAR vans being equipped with mobile data terminals. That is happening. All right, so your next question was, Seattle 911 recently settled a major lawsuit related to the use of blacklists or caution notes that required medics to wait for a police escort before entering certain addresses. Does Denver have a similar system in place? If so, what are the criteria for inclusion on the list, removal from the list, and what steps do you take to ensure that the list remains up to date and accurate? So this is a timely question. In response to that lawsuit, we have initiated a comprehensive audit of every caution note in our CAD. Caution notes are standard practice for any public safety agency. They can vary from things like access codes. If police or fire are responding to a gated community, they need the access code to get in. AED locations, so that we can direct callers to grab an AED if they're calling about a cardiac arrest. But then also safety information based on addresses. We don't have the ability to add notes based on individuals, just addresses. So what we are working through is a complete audit of all of those. I have also reached out to my peers in Seattle. The relatively new director out there was kind enough to share some of the draft policy language that they will be implementing in response to this lawsuit. So we're digging through that as well to see where we can learn from our partner's mistake wherever we can, and make changes to our policy as well. Julia?
Can you just say a little bit more, like, practically, how does that note work? I can understand if it's like you're dispatching to a gated community, the code's 6754, and like read that out loud. But like, if you've got a note on a building that's had multiple, like, do they just read that, or like, how does it work exactly?
Yeah, so the dispatcher will check the caution notes and air that information to responding units. Just anything that's relevant, at least. In the case of EMS, I did talk with our Denver Health folks. We do not and the audit will suss this out, but at least according to them, we do not have any caution notes that instruct EMS to wait for police. They may have a note that says, a resident that at this address is known to be violent toward EMS, use caution before entering, but we leave it up to the paramedics on scene to make that determination ultimately about how they respond.
Okay, and then, so it sounds like the audit you're conducting is about the words used in those notes. Are you also doing an audit of like the geographies or neighborhoods covered? And, it makes me think of broken windows policing a bit, to have, sort of notes related to communities. And I understand, if you're walking into a dangerous building, you should know that. But I'm just interested in sort of like, what's the data that you're auditing?
So it's all of the above. And what I can say is that this is definitely not a 911 only decision about any changes that we make. Those changes need to be made in partnership with our field response partners. So it will be a larger conversation about how do we use them today? Where should we adjust how we're using them? Making sure that we have, for example, any caution note can be put in with an expiration date. I found out that our current computer-aided dispatch software doesn't have the ability to alert us when a caution note is about to expire. It just kind of disappears. So finding a way to manage that a little more effectively, hopefully implementing technology to help us do that, is also a part of that audit process.
Thanks. Yeah, it also occurs to me in that case that, sometimes facilities change, right? You had the micro community that's going up is the location of a former, giant encampment, and you might have different levels of calls, et cetera, to that location once the community's built. Yeah. Okay.
All right. I talked about location-based routing now in effect for all major telecommunicators in Denver. I also should mention that Denver and the Colorado 911 Task Force, of which I am a voting member, is supporting the FCC's effort to mandate this nationwide. So a lot of the technology conversations around 911, those are happening not just at the state level, but at the national level. So just know that we are engaged on that as well. We are also, as a state, working to implement location-based routing through the secured IP network that delivers all 911 calls in the state of Colorado. We will have the ability to implement it there. So we're working through that with our technology partners. Julia?
Yeah, just my agency is in the process of deploying almost $1 billion to the state to improve broadband connectivity. But the question of connectivity is one that matters when people are trying to make phone calls in critical times. And so, do you have any perspective on cell coverage gaps in the city and how that might impact calls to your agency? And is there any relationship between those gaps and the services you provide? Are you working on that at all as a city in terms of public safety?
I am not aware of any cell coverage gaps as from a 911 perspective. We're pretty fortunate being in the center of a major metropolitan area that we've got pretty good coverage. With that said, there are mechanisms that any 911 authority within the state of Colorado can leverage to make improvements there. We work very closely with the Public Utilities Commission and have a great working relationship with them. So any issues that come up we're able to kind of partner with some bigger guns than just a single city. Boulder 911 was in the news a while back for new capabilities allowing them to access a caller's phone camera and precise location information. These capabilities are provided through a vendor called Prepared 911. The vendor lists Denver 911 as one of their partners on their website. Can you tell us more about your partnership with Prepared 911 and the capabilities it provides? I was not aware that we were listed as a partner on their website. I find that humorous. So Prepared 911 has a free service offering. It's kind of limited functionality within this video and advanced location information. Because it was free, I signed up at a conference to get Denver kind of squared away. We just haven't had the bandwidth to actually implement that tool. So I guess technically we have an account with them because we're not paying anything for it, but we're not currently using it. What I will say is that we are using what is effectively a competitor product that does provide the same functionality. We've been piloting it for the last 2 or 3 months. The way it works is, again, when we talk about the GPS data on your cell phone that goes into location-based routing, that is the same stuff that Uber and all the rest are using to find you. What these companies can do is outside of the 911 phone call, they can leverage that same technology to provide some better information. So the company that we're working with provides a widget that gives us that location information once the 911 call is connected. It gives us the ability, to send a text message to that caller. If they click the link and accept the permissions, right? We can't take over their camera. They have to accept the permissions. They can then stream video to our call takers in certain situations. So if they've got a house fire, they can stream video. We can view that, update responders as they go. Future state is we'll be able to then forward that stream to the responding fire truck, for example, so they can actually get eyes on the fire before they get there. The additional thing is location information. So one of the use cases, actually kind of the stories that we have is we got a call from 988. They transferred a call to us with a subject that was suicidal, claimed to have already taken several pills and was actively cutting themselves. They sent the call to us. Because the call was transferred outside of the 911 system, we don't automatically get location information for those callers. So we sent them a link through this tool. They clicked the link, accepted the permissions, and then we had precise location information for where they were. And it turned out they were in Boulder. They weren't in Denver. So we were able to warm transfer that call to Boulder 911. They were able to send help to that individual. These are the kind of tools that are incredibly valuable when it comes to saving lives. The location data that exists within the legacy 911 system is at times woefully inadequate. Just a couple of years ago, to kind of give you the counter perspective, we had a call from a gentleman who had driven up here from Phoenix. He had actually a call from his wife who was in Phoenix. She conferenced her husband in, and he had a stroke. The best location information we were getting from his cell phone was a 1 mile radius. And so our call taker tried every tool in the book. We didn't have this tool yet. Tried every other tool that we had to try and find him, and as close as we could get was 1 mile. So she was on the phone with him for close to 3 hours while police officers and fire trucks drove around, setting off their sirens, and she was listening, going, okay, you sound closer. Okay, now you sound farther away. And they eventually found him and got him to the hospital, and I'm glad to say he survived. But that's the kind of work that has to happen if you don't have these location tools. Julia.
For those of us who care about privacy, I presume that it's always opt-in from the user standpoint.
Yes. Okay. Yes, when you click the link, it says, do you want to grant access to share your location or your camera video? And they have to click yes. It's also worth mentioning that data is not stored. It's not stored on their device, and it's only stored in our system for as long as our data retention policy is. So it's not publicly available.
Thanks. I know we have probably about 10 minutes left with you.
I can blow through the last couple of questions pretty quick.
Sure, that's good. And then if there are board member questions, just go ahead and raise your hand now and I'll build the queue.
Okay, so the last bit really is around staffing. around our Mega Academy, mandatory overtime, wait times for 911 calls. So our Mega Academy, the first half have graduated. They were released in mid-September. And actually what we have seen, speaking to average wait times, is our average wait times have dropped by almost 70% after that first half of the academy graduated. The second half graduates at the end of November, early December. And then next week, we have another 14 new call takers joining the team. As of the 24th, we will be at just under 100% staffing for our 911 call takers, which is the product of a lot of work by the team here, by the recruiting team, safety HR. There's been a lot of folks who have helped us get here, and the work that we're doing is finally seeing fruit. It's also worth mentioning when we talk about staffing, it's not just getting folks in the door, it's keeping them here. And so our turnover rate in 2021 was 47%. In 2022, it dropped to 35%. And this year to date, we're only at 12.5% turnover, which is the best we've had in years. So a lot of the work that's happening here from a wellness, the city allowing me to pay my people more, what they deserve to be paid, all of that is bearing fruit, and we're seeing that in the turnover rates. The final thing I will throw out there is that technology is the long-term solution, not just throwing more people at the problem. People are going to keep moving to Denver. Our call volume is going to continue to increase, and adding FTE is untenable. So what we are also doing is looking at new technology solutions that can act as force multipliers for our team. I'll give you one quick example. One of the challenges that modern 911 faces is the preponderance of cell phones. When you have again, going back to that traffic accident on the highway, what used to be, 1 or 2 calls is now 50 within a very short period of time. And that really bogs down the system. When we talk about 911 hold times, it really is dependent on what's going on in the city. And a traffic accident is a great way to bog down our system. So one of the tools that we are reviewing is a call taking solution that would detect a sudden influx of calls from a small geofenced area, check the CAD and say, hey, there's a traffic accident in this area. And it will automatically insert a recording to anybody who calls 911 just from that space that says, if you're calling about the traffic accident at I-70 in Peoria, we already have units en route. If you are injured or involved, please stay on the line. Otherwise, you can disconnect. And that will alleviate some of that spike in volume that hits our team. So things like that to better use the team here and the resources are kind of our approach and where we're trying to go. Go ahead, Julia.
Yeah, just going back to the staffing, I think one of the things that's most challenging for you, at least in my experience in working in a city, is that the job of a dispatcher is high in trauma, right? Like you're dealing with people in crisis, you're hearing, horrible things happening as part of your job. And so, it's good to hear that your retention is way up, but, what sort of like mental health support do you provide to your agents?
So we have a couple of things that are in place. First is an agreement with a psychologist's office here in Denver. We mandate after a call taker or a dispatcher handles a certain traumatic call that they get the rest of the day off, paid admin time, and then we set up an appointment either in person or telehealth with a clinician for them to kind of talk through, and then we have to receive a clearance for them to return to work before they come back. We can usually do that within 24 hours, so it doesn't have much impact on staffing. We have also improved our kind of wellness and peer support efforts. So we have an operations supervisor who is essentially wearing 2 hats. She's an operations supervisor. She is also our wellness supervisor. She runs our peer support team, which is robust, as well as creating tools. One of the ones that she created, which is really cool, it actually pulls data out of our CAD and our phone system and ties it to individuals. So we have a dashboard where we can see, we looked at all the things that add stress doing this job, time on the phone, the nature of the calls that you're taking. Like if you get 10 parking complaints in a row, that's way better than getting 10, baby not breathing and, my husband is having a heart attack calls, right? Those have a lot more trauma associated with them. So we've scored those as far as kind of relative trauma. And then we have a dashboard where we can look at a week-to-week basis, who are our people who are dealing with some tough stuff, who's working a lot of overtime, and they've had a shooting, and they've had a baby not breathing. And our peer support team can proactively outreach to those folks and just say, hey, how you doing? What do you need? Are there any resources we can provide? So trying to take a more proactive approach to some of that. Though that's a high level overview. I could talk for an entire hour about the wellness stuff that the team here has created. It's incredible. But that's kind of the headline points.
Cool, great to hear. Any other board member questions?
So then I'll quickly touch on the last two. Director Saldate had been sharing that goal of merging non-emergency with 311. As far as what is required to make that happen, we're already working on it. We have a really good working relationship with the leadership team that oversees 311 over in TS. 311 currently lives within TS within the city, if folks didn't know that. So Laura Dunwoody is the director over there. She and I speak on a regular basis. And we are working on not just the operational side, but the technology side to kind of to make that a reality. As far as what that looks like in the future, don't know yet, but we're trying to lay the groundwork to make it as easy a lift as possible when and if the mayor's office says go. And then the final question that you had in here was, what is something that you wish more residents knew about Denver 911? And that would really be the caliber of folks that we have working here. The folks that come to work for Denver 911 come from all over. Most of our folks are not career 911 call takers. We have former teachers. We have former, finance bros. We have people who have worked in all industries and who have seen this as an opportunity to serve their community. And that service really goes beyond just showing up every day and answering those calls and dispatching help. Recently, with the migrant crisis, our team has been struggling with the number of calls that we're getting about young families and children that need help. And so one of our dispatchers felt that she needed to do more, as if being a first responder at 911 wasn't enough. And she has organized a clothing drive, a cold weather clothing drive, focusing on getting stuff for kids. And we are supplying those clothes to the star vans so that when they're out, when we're dispatching them to calls, they have those resources available. So for what it's worth, I will throw my email in the chat. If anybody has some kids' winter clothes that they want to donate, we would love to take them. But again, that was all led and created by some of our frontline staff wanting to support our newest neighbors. So that would be the main thing, is that we've got some really great people who work here.
Great. Well, certainly informative, lots to process and parse through. So thank you. I know there are a couple of items where we're still sort of waiting for data from you, and Daniel will follow up in some recent reports you've generated that I think we'd like access to. But yeah, I mean, obviously you have a really critical role in the public safety ecosystem here, and thanks for your service to the city and for spending time with us today.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Andrew.
You can feel free to drop off as well.
Okay.
Monitor Castle, are there items that you would like to talk about in executive session, ongoing investigations, or other relevant matters?
Yes, please.
Okay. May I have a motion to adjourn to executive session?
I moved.
All right, second. Got it.
Second.
All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Aye. All right. See you over there. Thanks so much for meeting today.